But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest.
To tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship.
Now, to go on to the word fascism, I would describe the type of government into which we have evolved as essentially fascist, yes.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Trust the experts, trust the experts. Trust the science, trust the science. CDC, CDC, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci. Mask on, mask off, 2 shots, 1 shot, mask on, 2 masks. Comply, comply.
Welcome to the Exit Your Matrix show, where we take the deep dive in search of truth. On the journey, we examine critical topics such as natural law, consciousness, morality, individual sovereignty, and the occult. And here's your host, Brad Villers. Welcome to episode 10 of the Exit Your Matrix show. So as we started last time, I am reading sections of Lysander Spooner's Vices Are Not Crimes. What's the full name of this? Vices Are Not Crimes, A Vindication of Moral Liberty. So we did section 1 last week, and here we go with section 2. Every voluntary act of a man's life is either virtuous or vicious. That is to say, it is either in accordance or in conflict with those natural laws of matter and mind on which his physical, mental, and emotional health and well-being depend. In other words, every act of his life tends, on the whole, either to his happiness or to his unhappiness. No single act in his whole existence is indifferent. Furthermore, each human being differs in his physical, mental, and emotional constitution, and also in the circumstances by which he is surrounded from every other human being. Many acts, therefore, that are virtuous and tend to happiness in the case of one person are vicious and tend to unhappiness in the case of another person. Many acts also that are virtuous and tend to happiness in the case of one man at one time and under one set of circumstances are vicious and tend to unhappiness in the case of the same man at another time and under other circumstances. So let's start with a review of the information we've covered to date. So first and foremost, we have talked about truth. And truth is, in its simplest definition, that which has undergone the process of manifesting in reality. It's what has actually happened, has occurred, and is currently occurring. And the other thing is to understand is that truth is belligerent. Truth cannot, by its very nature, care about anyone's feelings or beliefs, despite what we've been told about that. And truth can be known. Solipsism, on the other hand, is the adversary of truth and claims that perception is reality. We've all heard that before, right? It claims that the self is the only thing known to exist, and anything outside of the self, according to the definition of solipsism, is in doubt. We've also talked about cause and effect, and I think this is one of the biggest issues, is to understand true causes, true causal factors, both at the micro and the macro level. And so what I mean by that is to understand what cause is in terms of effect, both in the things that we act upon in our daily lives, but also how the accumulation of those actions by large groups of people have a macro effect. They have an effect on the aggregate population, the aggregate society, if you will. We've discussed aspects of manifested consciousness, and these are the trinity of thought, emotions, and actions. And they're very important in and of themselves, but the most important issue is to understand that if there is not harmony among them, then we have conflict and we will be setting ourselves up for suffering. There must be harmony and alignment between thought, emotion, and action. Brain structure and composition. We've discussed the triune brain and how it's composed of the reptilian brain at the base, or it's also called the brain stem, and those are responsible for fight, flight, freeze, or the survival instincts. Above that in the human being is the mammalian brain, which introduces the concept of emotion into our being. And then finally, there is the thinking human brain, neocortex, goes by different names at the very top. And that allows us to do all those things that are unique to human beings, to engage in philosophy and art, and to conceptualize things, and to do imaginative thinking, creative thinking, all those things. And again, just like with consciousness and with the other things that we'll be talking about, these multifaceted components all rely upon balance. And if they're out of balance, then we have a lot of issues, and again, we'll have suffering. The left and right brain. So it's important to see, and you can see here from this diagram, what the left and right brain are composed of and what they control and are associated with. But again, the importance is balance. We've talked before in a prior episode about, for example, the prison of the left brain, and we've talked about worldviews that, and we'll cover those in just a second, that are associated with left and right brain imbalance. So knowing what they control and what they're associated with is important, but again, it's the balance or lack of balance that is the key issue. And then there are two primary forces within each of us, and those are love and fear. Love expands consciousness, and fear constricts or binds consciousness. And when we experience love internally, we call that sovereignty or dominion. When we experience love externally or see it in the world externally, it is freedom. Fear experienced internally is confusion, and fear seen externally in the world is slavery. And I mentioned just ago those worldviews that I was talking about associated with left and right brain. So if we have a chronic imbalance to the left brain, we are going to have a worldview that is called randomness. And that means that there really are no rules, perception is reality, and anything goes. There is nothing, there's no rule of law or order in the universe or in the cosmos. And this leads to an order-giver master mindset. And if this continues and is adopted by large groups of people, we see this ultimately resulting in things like social Darwinism. If we have a chronic imbalance to the right brain, this is what we call a worldview of determinism. And this is basically that somehow or some way, everything is already decided and set down. And we see this a lot in religious traditions where turn it over to God, God has the plan, or some higher authority. And this leads to order follower and slave behavior. And if we see this in large groups of people, it can devolve into religious extremism and fundamentalism. But we do need to know that those aspects of randomness and determinism do exist in nature. So we see randomness, for example, in our free will. Each of us has the ability to make a decision about how we're going to act and determine to a great extent how we behave. And so that is our free will being exerted, and that's random. We don't know what that's going to be with any individuals around us, much less ourselves, right? So we also see determinism in the area of natural law. So determinism being that there are rules, there are things that are laid down, and they follow certain cosmic rules and guidelines, and that is what comprises natural law. Just a few weeks ago, we covered the 4 barriers to self-realization, and these are the things that go on within us that prevent us from ascending in consciousness, from really understanding who we truly are and why we truly are. And these are the 5-sense illusion, ego identification, the prison of the left brain, and institutionalized belief systems. So I do want to encourage you, please take advantage of Mark Passio's offer of his amazing repository of knowledge drive. As you can see here, it has thousands of audio files thousands of videos, thousands of books. This is from his collection. This is not his complete collection, I should point out, but some of the best stuff that he thinks he has. So if you go to his website, and I'll link that in the description, you can go and request the instructions of how to get that sent to him, and he will fill that disc up and give it back to you. And I'll tell you, it is a treasure trove. I've said this before, and I'll continue to mention it. That has probably some of the most interesting information on it that I have ever seen and been exposed to. And what it will also do, it will pique your interest, and it will take you down a road of awareness and awakening that is very unique, and really you can only get from accessing that kind of information. And finally, before we dive into today's topic, I would ask that you subscribe, like, share. That would be really great if you did those. The most important of the three, I think, is to share this and hopefully get this in somebody else's, in their inbox, and looking at this and thinking about it and engage them in a conversation about it. Use this as a launching point to discuss and debate these ideas. So today we continue with the subject of mind control, and specifically two features of the institutions that propagate it, and those are compartmentalization and hierarchy. But before we dig into that, just a few thoughts. In the final analysis, or as the corporate types like to say these days, at the end of the day, there are only two reasons human beings are fooled and suffer. And that is, the first being, they believe that which is not true, or second, they refuse to believe that which is true. So typically we think about freedom in terms of what we can do, right? Or I think a better description these days with our current circumstances is what we're allowed to do. But either way, it's phrased in terms of, I have the freedom to X, whatever that might be. But if we look at it from a different vantage point, a fair question to ask is exactly what this freedom is from. So, freedom from a specific oppressor, a king, a tyrant, some kind of a despotic ruler? Is it freedom from taxation without representation? We've heard that so many times, right? Is it freedom to attain a certain standard of living, a high standard of living in this example, compared to the rest of the world? Is it freedom to do anything that makes me happy, regardless of any consequences to the rest of humanity? But at its core, this is freedom from one thing, and that is suffering. And suffering is an unnecessary experience to us as human beings. It's something that we don't necessarily need to endure. Our cosmos operates on quantum dynamics, which just means an amount, so large amount. And that means large numbers of people thinking, feeling, and behaving in certain ways that create the reality that everyone experiences. Not just me, not just you. So sorcery is a low waveform vibration deployed through fear. And recall that sorcery is the science and art of influencing change to occur in accordance with will. And in the case of sorcery, that's lowercase will, the egoic will. The one condition that causes a person to become susceptible to external influences of very important aspects of our experience, of our lives, like worldview, belief systems, principles of morality, and so on, is fear. So I have a question for you. Do you believe fear is being used as a tool to manipulate people in order to achieve certain outcomes? If so, would you say that the use of fear is occasional, or would you say it's widespread? Okay? And if you think it's widespread, what are its ends? What are its motivations? What are the goals of those who deploy fear in that way? What is the character and nature of such people and groups? I think that's the key question. So sorcerers are a tiny portion of the population, but even though they are few in number, they exert significant influence and in many cases outright control because of a very important tool called leverage. So here I have found what I think is an awesome description or a visual aid on leverage, a depiction. So as you can see, this guy is using tools that without them he could not accomplish the task at hand. But with these very, in this case, simple tools, he is able to accomplish quite a bit of work, all through leverage. And I have to admit that I love this one because, as you can see at the bottom there, him catching the fish, it reminds me of this.
I caught you a delicious bass.
So you just saw some examples of using tools in the context of leverage for physical work, moving an object. But in this case, what I'm talking about is leverage in the form of occult knowledge. Conventional thinking suggests that it takes a large number of people to control a large number of people. But that isn't true when you introduce leverage in the form of all sorts of important, very poignant knowledge about the human psyche, behavior, weaknesses, and so on. So some time ago, I had done a quick look at the definition of the word occult in my beloved compact Oxford English Dictionary, but I needed to look at it more carefully and found out some pretty interesting things. So here you'll see, occult. These are the main components of the definition in the OED. Number 1, hidden from sight, concealed by something interposed, not exposed to view. Number 2, not disclosed or divulged, privy, secret, kept secret, communicated only to the initiated. I thought that was interesting. Number 3, not apprehended or not apprehensible by the mind, beyond the range of understanding or of ordinary knowledge, mysterious. Number 4, of the nature or pertaining to those ancient and medieval reputed sciences held to involve the knowledge or use of agencies of a secret and mysterious nature, as magic, alchemy, astrology, theosophy, and the like. So in addition to those 4 basic components of the definition, the dictionary also gives us these explanatory notes or uses of the word occult. So some secret art of the soul, which to us is utterly occult, and without the ken of our intellects. The dissipation of those things which constitute our body, being occult, and a thing which escapes the reach of our senses. Applied in early science or natural philosophy to physical qualities not manifest to direct observation, but discoverable only by experiment, or to those whose nature was unknown or unexplained. The Aristotelians gave the name of occult qualities to such qualities as they supposed to lie hid in bodies, and to be the unknown causes of manifest effects. Occult powers, known in nature, but unknown and unseen by vulgar heads and eyes. So with a kind of human operating manual, so to speak, the game really changes. And for this knowledge to be so powerful, it has to be hidden, or at least largely hidden, because it wouldn't be as effective or even effective at all if it were common knowledge. For those who have and are using that hidden occulted knowledge in sorcery, the target population has to be ignorant. And we should stop and look at how brilliant the technique is. The controllers don't have to send out the jackbooted thugs to enforce the outcomes they want. That's pretty 1940s. They're using a method that is much easier, much less expensive, and allows them to deny responsibility because they are doing it indirectly and not directly. So this isn't your dad's fascism, right? This is the new technology, where they're harnessing the power of occulted knowledge to cause us to do it to ourselves. And let me get to one of the most obvious and blatant examples we have seen in a long time, and that's COVID. And in the context of personal sovereignty, freedom, non-aggression, and morality, there are some obvious issues with how the whole COVID narrative played out, but I want to focus on one very specific part, and that is the proximate source or cause of the coercion. So let's go back to the episode where we covered institutionalized belief systems and the discussion of military and law enforcement. So let's take a look at that. The institutions of law enforcement and the military are the poster children for order giver and order follower behavior. those behaviors are both rewarded and demanded in those systems. Some of the most compelling and I believe honest comments and remarks on this subject come from Mark Passio.
This brings us to the issue of moral culpability when it comes to order followers. The question always arises, who's more morally culpable? Where does the real responsibility or blame lie? In the order giver or with the order follower? Moral culpability is the determination of who is ultimately at fault or deserving of blame for the commission of actions which result in harm or loss to other beings. Culpable as a word comes from Latin culpa, meaning blame, and the word culpable in English means at fault or deserving of blame. There is such a thing as blame. There is such a thing as who is at fault, who brought that resultant harm into manifestation in reality. So who is more morally culpable? And please read the question specifically. Who is more morally culpable? The painful truth, the order follower always bears more moral culpability than the order giver, because the order follower is the one who actually performed the action, and in taking such action, actually brought the resultant harm into physical manifestation. Order following is the pathway to every form of evil and chaos in our world. It should never be seen as a virtue by anyone who considers themselves a moral human being. Order followers have ultimately been personally responsible and morally culpable for every form of slavery and every single totalitarian regime that has ever existed upon the face of this planet.
Do you notice any similarities? I think a better question is whether there are any differences, because there aren't. It's the same play. The controllers call it, and the mind controlled, whether in their costumes or looking just like everyone else, they run it. Sure, they talked about hiring some soulless, neighborhood roaming scumbags to supply the coercion during COVID, but it was completely unnecessary because they were wildly successful in manipulating the vast majority of the citizenry into doing it for them.
This is not about freedom or personal choice. We've been patient, but our patience is wearing thin.
That's pretty bold to talk about losing your patience, huh?
I call on you to commit to concrete actions to stop the destruction of this magnificent planet. This conference is one of the most important meetings in history. On behalf of we, the 15, I ask you.
Please welcome the Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Draghi.
Again, my point here is twofold and really doesn't have a lot to do with COVID specifically, because this was standard operating procedure. So first, regardless of what your beliefs, and I would stress that they are beliefs, about what's taken place on that topic since 2020, it can't be denied that this is but one more example of this new paradigm of indirect versus direct influence, where our controllers leverage occulted knowledge to induce the mind-controlled to do their bidding. And second, that the primary tool they used and will always use is fear, and just how powerful a tool it is. Because for anyone who's honest enough to accept what's coming to light in the aftermath, masses of people were scared into doing things they would normally not do. For me, though, the biggest question is how many of those collectivist sheep pointing their pitchforks at the grandma killers and science deniers have the integrity to say those three important words I've discussed before, over and over. I was wrong. It's important to understand that sorcerers, in this case the controllers as I call them, intentionally disguise their intent. But you have to contrast this with the much larger groups, because I'd speculate that only a very small minority of the narrative-following COVIDians intended harm. With all but a few exceptions, I'd say they're well-intentioned. I believe most of those people are so captivated by authority that they were truly convinced of both what they were being told and what they were being told would be beneficial to do. We have to respect and, most importantly, understand that power. That a small group of people can control and direct the actions of a large group of people by means that those being controlled have so little or no understanding of the fact that they will willingly and enthusiastically engage in actions that are 100% in direct opposition to what they say they value. They had and probably still have no concept of what the controller's goals were. And this is accomplished through an often dismissed but extraordinarily powerful tool called compartmentalization. This is walling off different areas of interest and influence from each other such that different parties have no idea what the others are doing and their relation to the larger scheme. So I found an article here that I wanted to read some components from. So keep in mind I just found this from a web search, but I thought that the commentary was pretty interesting. And the background here is that the article is really framed around the 9/11 event, but the comments about compartmentalization I think hold true across the board. So here we go. In any case, the number one argument used to refute the hypothesis of a government false flag is the fact that such a conspiracy would be almost impossible to cover up because of the thousands of people who would have to be involved. But what if all the people involved, except those calling the shots, didn't know what they were working on and why they were working on it? Compartmentalization of information is a method of information security that has been around since the days of ancient Greece. It has been used when the powers that be didn't want anyone to find out about what they were doing. It's the practice of need-to-know information still widely used in the militaries of the world. It was used successfully to keep the secret of Greek fire dating back to 672 BC. And I'll show you here the definition of, from Wikipedia, at least a page, it'll give you a visual as well. By the way, I had never heard of Greek fire. Pretty interesting. So Greek fire was an incendiary weapon developed 672 and used by the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines typically used it in naval battles to great effect, as it could continue burning while floating on water. It provided a technological advantage and was responsible for many key Byzantine military victories, most notably the salvation of Constantinople from 2 Arab sieges, thus securing the empire's survival. The formula was obviously a secret the Eastern Roman government didn't want to get out. So its ingredients and instructions on how to make it were compartmentalized, in much the same way the Manhattan Project was compartmentalized a couple of millennia later to construct the world's first nuclear weapon, without the parties working on it knowing what they were building or why. The other tactic that's deployed in the mind control structure is hierarchy. So we have parts of the structure separated through compartmentalization, but we also have levels of the structure separated through hierarchy. The hierarchy is largely about who knows what. The higher up in the hierarchy, the greater the understanding of the entire effort, the big picture, if you will. And as you move down, the more narrow the view. As we get our minds around this, it becomes apparent then that any institution works on these principles. Even something that has the potential to be as benevolent or neutral as a business organization has both of these features. The CEO knows more than the vice presidents, and parts of the operation, like accounts payable, usually have no idea what's going on in, let's say, product development or sales. It's important to understand that at least the stated intention of those who misuse occult knowledge is to prevent powerful information from falling into irresponsible hands, or as they would say, the wrong hands. And especially when we see some of the behavior around us, this or their modern representatives sounds like a reasonable and well-placed idea. But it fails the test of natural law for this very simple reason. Knowledge is a possession and feature of the universe, of the cosmos. So in claiming to own it, or to have the audacity to claim to know how and with whom it should be and shouldn't be shared, that effort is rooted in the egoic self, the lowercase s self we've been talking about so much. And here we want to go back through those egoic slides. So these are the works of the sorcerer. Conversely, if those in possession of that knowledge were to share it with humanity, that action would be based in the broader, comprehensive self, the capital S self. And I want to go back to that prior point of at least the stated intention and justification of those who hold occult knowledge, not sharing it out of concern that it will be used improperly. The only way to ensure that knowledge does not fall into the wrong hands is to disseminate it widely and freely. Now, why is that? Because in doing so, it defeats the very two essential features of the institutions we were discussing earlier, compartmentalization and hierarchy. Those two things cannot exist where information is disseminated freely. So let's close the topic with a broader perspective. Compartmentalization and hierarchy are methods that prevent the dissemination of knowledge. The attempt to control what human beings can know, and by extension, what they can think and how they act, is by definition mind control. Finally, by far the best description I've heard is that mind control is ultimately the extermination of imagination. And you've heard me talk about how important and powerful imagination is. So I'd like to close this episode with some discussion on happiness. And I want to do that because I've criticized in the past the widespread messaging pretty much everywhere that you go and everyone you hear from, that the holy grail of human existence is happiness. But I didn't give you any additional explanation as to why or why I believe that, which I should have. So I'm going to start with an assumption that I believe is provable, and that is that the form of happiness all of these institutions and systems have to offer can pretty much be summed up concisely in these. There might be some more, but I think this is fairly comprehensive. Stuff or material goods, entertainment, physical comfort and pleasure, travel, food, money, and status. Now, the pinnacle of human existence, as it's told to us, is not the elevation of our intellects. It's not the exploration of curiosity and imagination. It's not the effort toward mastery of caring for ourselves, whether that be physical, psychological, or spiritual. It's certainly not the investigation into the true nature and character of institutions and systems of control. And it absolutely is not a journey toward heightened consciousness or the higher self that we've talked about. And don't forget for a second that our controllers aren't well aware that the things comprising the widespread happiness narrative are powerful motivators for people operating from the egoic self. And that condition, the egoic self, is exactly what we've been indoctrinated to value and what most people have been brainwashed into believing. Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, had this to say about happiness. Actual happiness always looks pretty squalid in comparison with the overcompensations for misery. And of course, stability isn't nearly so spectacular as instability. And being contented has none of the glamour of a good fight against misfortune, none of the picturesqueness of a struggle with temptation, or a fatal overthrow by passion or doubt. Happiness is never grand. Not bad, huh? So I look forward to the next episode when we'll go deeper into the topic of mind control. Until then, thanks for taking the time to be here, and remember to always do your own thinking. Until then, be well.